What if the real story isn't what you're being told? What if the people you think are in charge aren't? The headlines you scroll past? They're just the surface. How would you react if I told you that all the decisions are being made quietly, not by voters, not even by politicians, but by powerful groups working in the background, people you don't know exist? And the price of those decisions that are being made is something we all feel in our savings, our neighborhoods, and our security. Today, we'll delve deeper into what's really going on and why the media won't say it out loud. Or should I better say, why they can't. I've been thinking about something that happened recently, something that made me question certain things that most people don't pay much attention to. But when you really look at it, it tells you everything we need to know about how power actually works in this country. Think back to when a sitting president was essentially asked to step aside. Now, if you listen to the news, you might have thought this was about poll numbers or campaign strategy. But here's what they didn't emphasize. It wasn't voters who made that call. It wasn't even the typical political machinery you'd expect. Instead, it was a very specific group of people. We're talking about former presidents, major donors, Hollywood figures, and Silicon Valley money. Nancy Pelosi was involved, of course, but she was working alongside forces that operate far from the public eye. These aren't your typical politicians. They're what we might call the influence network. Now, why does this matter to you? Because it reveals something fundamental about how decisions get made. When you cast your vote, you probably assume you're participating in a system where your voice, combined with millions of others, shapes the direction of the country. But what if that's not quite how it works anymore? Think about it like this. Imagine you're part of a neighborhood association. You think everyone gets an equal say in decisions, but then you discover that 3 wealthy families who live on the hill have been meeting privately and essentially deciding everything before the official meetings even happen. The public meetings become theater. The real decisions happened earlier, in private rooms among people with very different interests than yours. That's essentially what we're looking at on a national scale. The wealthy donors, the entertainment industry, the tech billionaires, they form a network that can influence outcomes in ways that ordinary citizens simply cannot match. They have access, resources, and coordination that the rest of us don't possess. But here's where it gets really interesting. This influence network has created something of a problem for itself. By concentrating so much power in these elite circles, they've ended up building a political structure that's increasingly disconnected from regular people. They've prioritized ideological purity and activist energy over the kind of broad appeal that actually wins over voters in the long run. Remember Bill Clinton? Whether you liked his policies or not, he understood something crucial. To win and govern effectively, you need to appeal to the center. You need to speak to people who work regular jobs, raise families, worry about crime in their neighborhoods, and want a secure border. These aren't radical concepts, they're just common sense concerns of everyday Americans. But that kind of centrist approach requires leaders who aren't beholden to the most extreme voices in their coalition. And here's the challenge. When your power base consists of Hollywood activists, Silicon Valley ideologues, and donor-class progressives, you end up terrified of disappointing them. Even if you want to move toward the center, even if you recognize that's where elections are won, you can't, because the people funding and supporting you will turn on you immediately. Let me give you an example of how this plays out. California's governor tried briefly to pivot toward more moderate positions after seeing election results. For about a month, he started talking like a centrist. But the reaction from his base was swift and harsh. Within weeks, he was back to the same progressive positions, even more extreme than before. His polling numbers? They dropped to around 6% for future national prospects. This creates a fascinating dynamic. The very people who have the most influence over political decisions are often the least representative of what ordinary Americans actually want. They live in different worlds, with different priorities, different daily concerns. When a Hollywood celebrity or Silicon Valley executive thinks about policy, they're not worried about the same things as a retired teacher in Ohio or a small business owner in Arizona. This disconnect explains something that puzzles a lot of people. Why do politicians keep pushing policies that poll poorly? Why do they focus on issues that most Americans don't rank as priorities? It's because they're not really responding to the general public, they're responding to the people who have the most influence over their careers and their access to resources. The result is a political class that's increasingly out of touch with the middle class. They're responsive to activist networks, donor demands, and media pressure, but not necessarily to the bread and butter concerns of working people. Issues like border security, street crime, economic stability, and national defense, things that consistently poll as top priorities for most Americans, get less attention than ideological crusades that energize the base but leave everyone else cold. Now, this isn't just happening in one party. Both sides have their own version of this dynamic. But what's particularly striking is how this elite influence has shaped the kinds of leaders who rise to prominence. Instead of developing candidates who can appeal broadly across different groups and regions, the system has produced leaders who are very good at satisfying the demands of their most active supporters, but struggle to connect with the wider public. Think about the historical parallel here. There was a time not so long ago when a party might suffer a devastating electoral loss and then spend years reflecting, adapting, learning. They'd develop new leaders who could speak to a broader coalition. That process took time, sometimes decades, but it produced politicians who could actually win and govern effectively. But today, the pressure from these influence networks makes that kind of adaptation much harder. When you lose an election, instead of asking, how do we better serve the needs of ordinary Americans, the question becomes, how do we better mobilize our existing base? Instead of broadening appeal, the tendency is to double down on what already isn't working. This creates a sort of political trap. The very success of these elite networks in gaining influence has made the political system less responsive to regular people and less capable of producing the kind of centrist leadership that can actually solve problems and unite the country. And here's what makes this particularly relevant today. People are starting to notice. When you have overwhelming media coverage favoring one side, when you have fundraising advantages of 2.5 to 1, when you have all the institutional advantages, and you still can't connect with voters, that tells you something important about the gap between elite opinion and popular sentiment. The issues that matter most to regular Americans, border security, economic opportunity, safe neighborhoods, a strong defense, these aren't partisan issues, really. They're common sense issues. But when political leaders are more worried about satisfying activist networks than addressing these practical concerns, they end up on the wrong side of public opinion, even with all the advantages money and media can provide. This brings us to a crucial question. What happens when this disconnect becomes too obvious to ignore? When the gap between elite priorities and popular concerns becomes so wide that it can't be bridged by better messaging or more sophisticated campaigns? History suggests that eventually the system has to adapt or face repeated defeats. But adaptation requires leaders who are willing to challenge their own coalitions, to risk disappointing their biggest supporters in order to serve a broader public interest. And that's exactly what the current influence structure makes almost impossible. The fear factor is real. When you know that criticizing certain positions will bring down the wrath of powerful activists, when you know that deviating from orthodoxy will cost you funding and media support, when you know that even attempting moderation will be seen as betrayal, well, that creates a powerful incentive to just stay in line, even when you know it's not working politically. But there's another dynamic at play here that's even more interesting. The influence network that's gained so much power isn't really interested in traditional politics at all. They're not politicians in the classic sense. They're activists, influencers, and ideologues who are more interested in cultural and social transformation than in the practical work of governing. This means they're perfectly comfortable with political strategies that don't actually win elections, as long as those strategies advance their broader agenda. They'd rather lose elections while maintaining ideological purity than win elections by compromising with the political center. From their perspective, electoral politics is just one tool among many, and not necessarily the most important one. Understanding this helps explain why the response to electoral defeats is often to become more extreme rather than more moderate. If your primary goal isn't winning elections but advancing a cultural agenda, then electoral losses can actually be useful. They prove that the system is rigged, that the opposition is illegitimate, that more radical action is necessary. But this creates a fundamental mismatch between what these influence networks want and what democratic governance requires. Democracy, at its core, is about building coalitions broad enough to win elections and then implementing policies that serve the general welfare. It's about compromise, moderation, and finding common ground among people with different interests and perspectives. The current influence structure pulls in exactly the opposite direction. It rewards extremism, punishes compromise, and prioritizes ideological consistency over practical results. It's more comfortable with protest than with governance, more interested in making statements than in making progress. And that brings us to the heart of what's really happening behind the scenes, a fundamental conflict between two different visions of how power should work in America. One vision sees power flowing from the top down, from wealthy donors to politicians to voters. The other sees it flowing from the bottom up, from communities to representatives to policy. And right now, we're watching these two visions clash in real time, with consequences that affect every aspect of our daily lives. Now, you might wonder, if this top-down influence is so powerful, why doesn't it work more effectively? After all, we witnessed a campaign that had every institutional advantage you could imagine. Massive fundraising superiority, favorable media coverage reaching near universal levels, support from every major cultural institution. Yet somehow, despite all these advantages, the message still didn't resonate with enough voters. This tells us something fascinating about the relationship between media narratives and actual public sentiment. Think about it. When you have the vast majority of mainstream media outlets presenting one consistent viewpoint, when you have social media platforms amplifying certain messages, when you have celebrities and influencers all pushing in the same direction, and it still doesn't move public opinion the way you'd expect, what does that tell us? What do you think? It most probably suggests that people are increasingly looking past the noise and focusing on results. They're asking themselves, regardless of what I'm being told, what am I actually experiencing? Are my neighborhoods safer? Is my financial situation improving? Do I feel more secure about the future? These are the questions that matter when people are alone in the voting booth. This disconnect between media messaging and lived experience has created something I find really intriguing. People have developed what you might call a filtering system. They've learned to separate the performance from the substance, the rhetoric from the reality. They're paying less attention to what politicians say and more attention to what actually happens in their communities. And that brings us to an important historical parallel that helps explain where we are today. This isn't the first time a political movement has had to grapple with the gap between elite preferences and popular appeal. If you look back at the 1970s, you see a similar pattern. After a devastating electoral loss, there was a period of soul-searching that lasted nearly 2 decades. The party had to evolve from appealing primarily to activists and ideologues to developing leaders who could speak to working-class concerns. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of defeats, reflection, and gradual adaptation. The key insight from that era was that electoral success requires leaders who can transcend their base and appeal to people who don't share their ideological commitments. Someone like Bill Clinton succeeded not because he abandoned progressive principles, but because he understood that you have to address the practical concerns of middle-class families if you want their support. Clinton talked about adding police officers to the streets, securing the border, and reforming welfare positions that spoke to the daily concerns of working people, even if they weren't popular with activist groups. He understood that governance requires building coalitions that extend far beyond your most enthusiastic supporters. But here's what's different now. That kind of adaptation has become much more difficult because of how the influence networks we discussed earlier operate. Today's activist movements aren't just interest groups trying to influence policy. They're cultural forces that can mobilize quickly and effectively to punish any deviation from orthodoxy. Think about it this way. In previous eras, if a politician wanted to move toward the center, they might face criticism from purists within their own party, but that criticism would be manageable. Today, a single statement that deviates from activist expectations can trigger massive social media campaigns, boycotts, and public shaming that can destroy careers overnight. This creates what we might call the moderation trap. Even politicians who recognize that centrist positions would be more popular with voters become afraid to take those positions because of the immediate backlash they'll face from their own side. They end up trapped between electoral necessity and coalition demands. The result is political leaders who sound like they're speaking to a very narrow audience even when they're trying to appeal to the broader public. They use language and focus on issues that energize their base, but leave everyone else feeling alienated or confused. We can see this dynamic playing out very clearly if we look at what's happening in places like California. Here's a state that's completely dominated by one political perspective, where leaders should theoretically have the freedom to experiment with different approaches. Yet even there, attempts at moderation get shut down almost immediately. Take the current governor's brief flirtation with centrist messaging after recent election results. For a few weeks, he started talking about practical solutions, acknowledging that some progressive policies weren't working as intended. But the reaction from activist networks was so swift and so harsh that he quickly reversed course, ending up with positions that are even more extreme than where he started. This pattern tells us something important about how these influence networks operate. They're not just trying to win elections, they're trying to maintain ideological control. From their perspective, a leader who compromises with the center is actually more dangerous than a leader from the opposition, because compromise legitimizes the idea that their worldview isn't the only acceptable one. So instead of learning from electoral defeats, instead of adapting to changing circumstances, the tendency is to double down on positions that may feel morally satisfying but don't actually solve problems or win over skeptical voters. The focus becomes maintaining purity rather than achieving practical results. But while this dynamic has created challenges for traditional political institutions, it's also created opportunities for a different kind of leadership to emerge. And this is where things get really interesting, because we're starting to see a fundamental realignment in American politics that cuts across the old categories. What's happening is that working class and middle class Americans, regardless of their background, are starting to recognize that they have more in common with each other than they do with the elite networks that claim to represent them. A truck driver in California, a carpenter in Michigan, a small business owner in Florida, these people face similar challenges and have similar concerns, even if they come from different ethnic backgrounds or geographic regions. This represents a shift from what we might call identity-based politics to class-based politics. Instead of being organized primarily around racial, ethnic, or cultural categories, political coalitions are starting to form around shared economic interests and practical concerns about daily life. Think about what this means. A Mexican-American construction worker has more day-to-day concerns in common with a white plumber than either of them has with wealthy celebrities or Silicon Valley executives who claim to speak for their communities. They're all worried about inflation, crime, job security, and their children's futures. They all want safe neighborhoods, good schools, and economic opportunity. This realignment helps explain why traditional political predictions have become so unreliable. When you assume that people will vote primarily based on their demographic characteristics, you miss the growing importance of class-based concerns that cut across those traditional boundaries. It also explains why messages that focus heavily on cultural or ideological issues often fall flat with working-class voters, while messages that address practical, bread-and-butter concerns can resonate across different communities. People are less interested in symbolic politics and more interested in policies that will actually improve their lives. This shift has profound implications for both political parties, but is particularly challenging for the influence networks we've been discussing. These networks have built their power by claiming to represent various identity groups, but if those groups start prioritizing shared class interests over cultural divisions, that undermines the entire basis of elite influence. Think about it. If a Hispanic shop owner in Arizona starts prioritizing her interests as a small business owner rather than her ethnic background, then the ability of cultural elites to speak for these communities starts to erode. This is why you see such intense resistance to politicians who try to build these cross-cutting coalitions. It's not just about policy disagreements, it's about preserving a system where elite networks can maintain influence by claiming to represent people who may not actually share their priorities. But the realignment is happening anyway, because the underlying economic and social pressures are too strong to ignore. When working families are struggling with inflation, when small businesses are being crushed by regulations, when communities are dealing with crime and disorder, these practical concerns eventually override cultural messaging, no matter how sophisticated or well-funded that messaging might be. This brings us to a crucial question about where all of this is headed. We're witnessing a fundamental conflict between concentrated elite influence and a growing middle-class resistance to that influence. The elites have institutional advantages, media control, financial resources, cultural platform, but the middle class has numbers and, increasingly, a shared sense that the current system isn't working for them. The question is whether our political institutions can adapt to this realignment, or whether we're heading for continued instability as these two forces pull in opposite directions. History suggests that eventually democratic systems do respond to sustained popular pressure, But that process can take time and involve considerable turbulence along the way. What makes this moment particularly significant is that the stakes extend beyond normal political competition. We're not just talking about which policies get implemented or which party controls government. We're talking about whether democratic governance can function effectively when there's such a large gap between elite opinion and popular sentiment. The current system creates incentives for leaders to satisfy narrow interest groups rather than serve broad public interests. It rewards performance and symbolism over practical problem solving. It encourages division rather than unity, because division is more useful for maintaining separate bases of support. But sustainable democratic governance requires the opposite: leaders who can build broad coalitions, solve practical problems, and unite people around shared interests rather than divide them around cultural differences. It requires a political class that's accountable to voters rather than to unelected influence networks. The encouraging news is that we're starting to see signs of this kind of leadership emerging, particularly at the local and state level. Politicians who focus on practical problem solving, who speak to shared concerns rather than cultural divisions, who prioritize results over rhetoric. These leaders may not get much national attention, but they're showing that effective governance is still possible when leaders are willing to put public service ahead of coalition management. So, what we're really witnessing is a struggle between two different models of how democracy should work. One model sees political power as something that should be managed by educated elites who know better than ordinary citizens what policies and priorities should be pursued. The other model sees political power as something that should emerge from the practical concerns and shared interests of working families. Right now, the elite model has many advantages: institutional support, financial resources, cultural influence, but it's increasingly out of touch with the lived experiences of most Americans. The populist model has fewer institutional advantages, but growing popular support, especially among people who feel that the current system has failed them. The outcome of this struggle will shape American democracy for decades to come. Will we move toward a system that's more responsive to ordinary citizens, or will elite influence continue to dominate political decision-making? Will leaders emerge who can bridge these divides, or will the polarization continue to deepen? What I find most hopeful about this moment is that people are starting to ask the right questions. They're looking past the headlines to understand who really makes decisions and how those decisions affect their daily lives. They're recognizing that their interests may have more in common with their neighbors than with distant elites who claim to represent them. This awareness is the first step toward positive change. Because ultimately, democratic systems work best when citizens are engaged, informed, and willing to hold their leaders accountable, not just to abstract principles or activist demands, but to the practical needs of real communities and working families. The patterns we're seeing today will continue to evolve, and the choices we make as citizens will help determine whether that evolution leads toward better governance or continued dysfunction. If this conversation opened your eyes, don't just move on. Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the next story we cover may be even more important than this one. And remember, what you're not being told is often the most urgent truth of all.